Hey guys. So hopefully this video is pretty short today. I wanted to touch on, again, kind of a specific phenomenon, which is the day after the fight, whenever the day after the fight begins. Some fights can go on for like multiple days, and some fights end up only being for like, a few hours or something like that. It just depends on how messed up things can get. But whenever the next day starts, and by the next day what I'm talking about is when things start to reconcile and the healing process begins, I wanted to talk about this day specifically within these types of dysfunctional relationships where both people are kind of looking for a fantasy for different reasons. And I wanted to hone in on what I see myself having struggled with in the past. There's still remnants of this that I still struggle with even today. And it is something that I'm working on fixing, where it is kind of like going to the mental gym a little bit. And these muscles aren't as strong as I would like them to be, but it is getting better. And I wanted to kind of talk about like what my next day reflexes are looking like now. And when I reminisce on my past self, who had a lot weaker like mental muscles and a lot more dysfunctional mental habits, what my next day after a fight used to look like versus now. The next day after a fight is actually where you can learn a lot about your own mental habits and your own mental processes, and how much you do or do not struggle with like fantasy-based thinking, honestly. Like, yes, you can learn a lot about yourself within the actual fight, for sure, always. But the next day and the reconciliation process after fights actually reveals a lot about us as well, especially once the emotions have cooled down and we're not necessarily in as much of fight or flight mode. I mean, it's not that it's not there at all. We definitely can still be in fight or flight mode or survival mode, and that feeling of I need to just survive can definitely play into the reconciliation process and the decisions that we make. But just from like a mechanism standpoint, and like what we do with our thoughts about ourselves and the other person, and what we do with our thoughts and feelings about what has just occurred that was maybe very upsetting to us, you can learn a lot about yourself in the next day. So when we're looking at what is essentially like the merry-go-round cycle of abuse, or anything that kind of imitates this cycle of like heavy dysfunction or abuse and then reconciliation, one thing that is not really allowed to exist in these types of dysfunctional relationships is boundaries. So because boundaries are not encouraged or really allowed for these types of relationships to be able to continue, fantasy roles basically have to exist, because there has to be a way to learn to either survive within these relationships mentally and to be able to compartmentalize things so that you basically don't go insane trying to love this person who is hurting you, or even trying to deal with like how you yourself are acting. There really almost has to be compartmentalization and illogical thinking that happens for this thing to continue to be able to survive. Because if it gets assessed more realistically, and if healthier habits are allowed to or are attempted to be brought into these types of situations, everything starts to fall apart. And I think it makes sense why that's the case. So when I was really examining like the changes that I've noticed in myself with my next day habits, one thing that I really saw is that I still have this tendency on the next day to want to start infantilizing people. That's my next day habit. I think everyone has a different like next day role for the reconciliation to be able to occur. Some people have to become the hero, because the person who is more of the emotionally regressed person in the relationship, they maybe need the other person to be the caretaker. Or we become the caretaker. We become the person who infantilizes the other person and on the next day after the fight. And because they are infantilized, we have to therefore become the caretaker. And really what I kind of almost see it as is a parent-child relationship. Maybe that sounds fucked up, but that is just how I see it, one person becomes the helpless child, or just a child of sorts, and the other person becomes the one picking up the pieces. And it's really interesting to me that this is the case, because so much of this for both people on both sides has to do with like parent wounds and like early childhood wounds with parents. And here we are almost trying to like replicate the parent-child relationship on either side with whichever role you end up imitating. It's almost like we're trying to heal that negative parent-child experience through some sort of like reenactment process in the reconciliation stage, where someone becomes the parent healing the child. Someone becomes like the hero. I really see it as like a hero parent, and someone becomes almost like a helpless child. And there's this idea of like the parent rescuing the child, the parent loving the child. And I have no idea what that's about. I don't know if anyone else has touched on that in any other channels, but for me, it's just interesting because so much of this comes down to parent-child wounds from, you know, our childhood with our parents. I digress. Thanks. There is just kind of like this hero role that people will go into, where you're over romanticized as the hero, or someone becomes infantilized as like totally helpless. They didn't mean to do it. You know, they're almost helpless to their own demons and their own whims and their own mechanisms. So you compartmentalize them out into like someone who almost is held hostage by a different like third entity, which is their more true self when they get upset. But you separate those two people out in a way, and the person that's left is someone who can't control their habits, and therefore they're helpless to this other state of themselves. And then both of you come to kind of like hate their second state together. So that is something that for me, that was my go-to, is I would kind of become the caretaker, and I would become the person who infantilized the other person, so that I could sort of reconcile what they had done to me and what I had just gone through with them, with a lot of like the verbal abuse that occurred. And then I would come to see them as a helpless child, so that I could feel like I could come back to them in a safe way and we could make things better afterwards. But because this became such a heavily ingrained habit with me, because I first learned to do this in my childhood, and then I also, you know, met someone later who had similar habits to the adults in my childhood. So I started replicating that with other people. That was the person who groomed me when I was 13. And then after that sort of indoctrination that happened for 3 years, I continued to go and be with other people who had similar sort of emotional habits. So for me, the pattern of my life has been finding people who get infantilized and who sort of hide behind this sort of fantasy role afterwards. That's what's my normal, that's what's comfortable to me, so that's my next day habit. And so because that is what is sort of like ingrained in my mind, what I've noticed is that now the problem that has occurred, which is getting better, but the problem that's occurred is because this is what my brain does, this is what my brain expects everyone to do, this is the dance that my brain follows and expects to occur between every single person that I encounter. I've noticed what my brain does is, even if someone hasn't necessarily prompted me to infantilize them, and the other part of all of this is sweeping everything under the rug, right? So even if someone hasn't even prompted me yet to sweep everything under the rug and start infantilizing them, I will naturally start doing that on the next day. Whenever I know that the reconciliation is supposed to start, whenever things have finally cooled down, my brain will have this kind of knee-jerk reaction of just like, great, so now we pretend nothing happened. Now we pretend that everything is all good. The imaginary phase starts to kick in, you know, whereas whatever I had realized the day before about the person that was truly upsetting to me, usually when I was seeing things the clearest, my brain's like, nope, we forget that now. We go into imaginary thinking, essentially. We put them in a fantasy role. You know, don't listen to any of your emotions. You don't listen to any of your thoughts. It's very extreme. You know, it is its own form of black and white thinking, truly. So once I started becoming aware of the fact that my brain did this, even when the other person maybe wouldn't have even wanted me to do it or prompted me to do it, it's another way that we are replicating part of the cycle of abuse with ourselves, even if no one else is like encouraging us to reenact this cycle. We have picked up the habits and we are reenacting it too. We are encouraging that to happen too. And I also encouraged this to happen because I also needed to exist. I needed to exist in the fantasy, like I said, for this relationship to survive. Also because I didn't know how to exist in relationships without there being some sort of fantasy dynamic in a way, from my own issues with limerence and lots of other things. So I was now aware of the fact that my brain doesn't really have good mental habits the following days after fights with people. That my go-to habit is to start replicating this cycle of abuse, and that's a problem. That's a problem because I'm not encouraging other people to be allowed to really process things with me in a more nuanced way. I also am not letting myself exist within nuance on the days after fights. And then because I'm encouraging myself to compartmentalize things, put things in a box, not really remember the things that happened that were truly upsetting to me, that also causes black and white thinking to continue to occur. Because if I'm sweeping everything under the rug and then I'm pushing them into some fantasy type role, how is anything really getting truly processed? Not even just together, but also inside of myself internally. And also, how am I really letting that person that I'm involved with, if this is in a romantic sense, or with family, wherever this might be occurring, how am I giving that myself the opportunity to really care about that person in a nuanced way if I have to have them exist within a fantasy role to be able to forgive them? Because that's the whole point of the days that follow the fight, the reconciliation phase, that is about forgiveness. So what I really realized when I was examining this is the type of forgiveness that was occurring with me, with other people, was actually a false type of forgiveness. And I know that sounds really strong and harsh, but the reason why I say that is because the only way I was actually able to forgive people was by having a false view of them, to be able to feel like I even had the ability to forgive them. For me to even be able to entertain the thought of reconciling and forgiving, I had to come to view them in a false way and push them into a fantasy role so that I could even access that possibility for myself of being able to do that with them. So that really is false forgiveness, for me at least, in my opinion, because I think true forgiveness and reconciliation, and by the way, I'm using this word forgiveness when you're still attempting to keep the relationship alive. There are other forms of forgiveness where you internally forgive people, but you aren't trying to reconcile. You aren't trying to continue the relationship. But I'm specifically speaking about when you want the friendship, the relationship, whatever, to occur or to continue to exist. You're trying to forgive. You're trying to move forward. And how are you actually doing that in an authentic way if you're not letting yourself really live and exist in what happened, to continue to process that and let that dysfunction continue to exist and be real? It doesn't go in a box. It stays out in the open, and you have to look at it and you have to decide if you can really live with that. And if you can't, then you have to start asking yourself other questions instead. The other piece of the whole reconciliation process is having empathy and sympathy with people. And I also became aware of the fact that from the world that I had grown up in and the way that I was taught to engage in the reconciliation process, like what my parents taught me, the dysfunctional way my parents taught me to reconcile, and then the other relationships that I was engaged in taught me, I learned that empathy and sympathy could not exist with boundaries. So what I mean by that is oftentimes you're going to experience dysfunction with people, and the answer and the solution should not always be to just cut them out of your life 100%. Sometimes that is the answer. Sometimes that is the solution. But there's this whole category of person that exists in the world, sometimes including us, where we have a certain amount of dysfunction, and people want to continue to have a relationship with us, or we want to continue to have a relationship with that person who has some dysfunction. But now there's going to be a need for boundaries, and there's going to be a need for breaks. So especially in the dating process, if I'm dating someone and it's following a certain progression and pace, and then some amount of dysfunction occurs, well, now I'm going to change my pace. now I'm going to slow down a little bit, which hopefully I was already going pretty slow. But if I'm a person who's still learning how to go slow, and maybe I was going slower, but things were still going kind of fast, now there's definitely going to be a need for breaks. And let's say that within friendship or something, there was a certain amount of intimacy occurring at a certain pace. Then dysfunction occurs and you realize, oh wait, now there's a need for boundaries. Now I don't want you necessarily entering into the same intimate spaces that I was letting you in before. Either way, there's a need for change within the relationship. And you still want to have sympathy and empathy for this person. You still want to get to know them. You still want to be able to try to see their perspective and have that kind heart towards them, but now there's a need for fences and breaks. And in the world that I used to exist in for a really long time, those things all make you either a bully or abusive or mean. There's all of these really extreme things that I was taught about having fences, having boundaries, and slowing down your pace with someone, which was that I was essentially being really mean to them. And I was almost abusing them in whatever form, punishing them unfairly. If after experiencing behavior that I found inappropriate, I had boundaries of any kind, or I changed my pace with them in any kind of way, that was unfair, that was undeserved. I would get crucified, truly, for doing any of that afterwards. So what do you think I learned? I learned that that is unkind. So to be a kind person, you don't have boundaries. To be a kind person, there's only one way of showing kindness, and it's having no boundaries, no change of pace. You go at their pace, which is always usually very fast. You're essentially enmeshed with them. Emotionally enmeshed, they get to come all the way into your life, because to do anything else is to be cruel, truly. And that is something I've also come to understand is just totally not true. I see how women especially will perpetuate this idea onto each other. Within female culture, I still see this being a very real problem, where even with my female friends, when I'm talking about a fight that I had with someone else and I'm talking about the boundaries that I'm now going to enact with that person, they don't even have a stake in the fight. But when they hear me talking about how, this person's no longer going to have as much access to me, these are the ways that I'm going to have to modify whatever metaphorical house was being built, there's going to be a change to the blueprint. And I hear a lot from other women when they listen to me talk about this. No, don't do that because that's going to hurt their feelings. No, don't do that because they might not be able to handle it. And it's very much this others focused approach where you're not supposed to think about yourself. You're not supposed to help yourself. It's about their happiness. It's about especially if someone has this very fragile role that they've taken on. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to maybe hurt the fragile person, when a lot of times this is a very manipulative tactic that is taken, and you have to be allowed to take care of yourself. You have to be allowed to take care of yourself. You have to learn what you can handle and know your own limits, and then build your life in regards to those limits. And that doesn't make you a mean person, and you can't just walk around in life with this others focused role constantly. It's obviously very dysfunctional for a lot of different reasons. So half of the problem is not knowing what to do with the bad that just occurred. That's basically what I've just been discussing for the first half of this video, is we don't know what to do with the bad, so we put it in a box and we don't think about it anymore. And we just go back to all good thinking. The other half of the problem, though, is that we also don't know what to do with the good. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is once you start dealing with dysfunction, the thing is that doesn't always mean that people have to just be 100% cut out of our lives. There's so many different ways that we are all dysfunctional. There's not just only dysfunction with people with cluster B personality disorders. People with PTSD and legitimate trauma have dysfunction. But also nowadays, just people in general have dysfunction. So many people have addictions to different random things. So many people just have not been taught how to even deal with processing their own emotions. There's a plethora of ways that we are all dysfunctional. So because of that, when you encounter dysfunction, that's the bad that you don't know what to do with. But the other part of that is that with the good, do you know how to exist with the good in someone who is dysfunctional? Do you know how to let them be both dysfunctional and have good qualities that you can see benefits your life? Are there relationships that we've been in where we're not allowed to remember or react to the things that have happened, where the other person makes us feel like we are not allowed to acknowledge the thing the day after. We're not allowed to remember the very real thing the day after. You know, we're not allowed to really just have any opinions about it, the sweeping the under the rug thing, you know. But at the same time, are we doing this to ourselves? Are we allowing ourselves to remember? Are we allowing ourselves to react? Are we allowing ourselves to exist in the discomfort of the thing that happened the next day? There is what other people put on us, and there's what we put on ourselves. And that's really what I kind of wanted to address today, is the mechanisms that I realized I had with myself when no one else was even in the room, when no one else had even prompted me, when no one else had even asked this of me. I was doing it with myself. I was hindering myself. I was limiting myself. I was not allowing myself to exist in the thing that happened the next day. I was the one sweeping it under the rug. I was the one giving myself memory loss and making myself feel like I had to have memory loss. I was the one not letting myself exist with both the good and the bad of someone. And there's a very real reason why I almost had to do this and why it was such a struggle for me to remember the good. Do you almost have to see people as all evil? Because if you don't, then you don't know how to keep your boundaries and your fences up. Is it almost like a handicap for you that if you don't think of people as all bad, if you start letting yourself remember the good, all this shit starts falling apart inside of you, and you don't know how to continue to hold it together. You don't know how to continue to keep your fences up, and you almost have to think of them as all evil so that you can. That is a legitimate handicap, because no one is all evil and no one is all good. And that was the last thing I wanted to touch on in this video, is it's very interesting to me how what I'm describing right here, just within the cycle of myself, I can't speak for you guys. I don't know who this resonates with. And that's the main thing that I've realized, like, I need to go to like the mental gym essentially to work on in my next day reflexes, are making sure that I am having forgiveness and sympathy and empathy for people without them being in a fantasy role. Like, I need to make sure that I'm not shoving people into fantasy boxes, and I need to make sure that I'm also not sweeping things under the rug and making myself forget about things. That's the part where I really am responsible, and I need to make sure that I'm working on my own mental mechanisms, because that's a very like bad habit that I was in, and that was not letting me truly forgive people in the proper way that I should be if I'm trying to be a good friend. That's not letting me actually continue to have real true sympathy and empathy for people, where I'm letting myself really truly see the dysfunction that they have going on, but also letting myself remember the good things about them, because those are things that should be remembered, that they should get credit for as a person. You know, how am I letting both of those things continue to exist at the same time, while also working on having the correct boundaries for myself that I want to have? That's a very like complex thing that I've had to learn that I even need to work on, let alone like the realization was the first part that had to come to me, and then being very intentional about this and being aware of my own mental mechanisms after fights with people, especially people who are newer in my life. You know, that's really where the sort of storming, forming, and norming phases are going on, where you're beginning to establish habits with each other. That's really where I have to be very intentional about my mental mechanisms after brand new fights that I'm having with people who are newer to my life, because that's, I feel like, where there's even more of a temptation to shove them into a fantasy box. What's very interesting about this is very similar to the idealization and devaluation cycle that occurs. And it's not the same, because ours is done for completely different reasons. And also I am able to get out of it and relearn how to think in a better way, because that's not some sort of almost like genetic neurological issue going on in my mind. Like, I can relearn a different way of interacting with people. But it is very interesting to me, and as always on my channel, I like exploring the different ways that we are similar, because I am secure enough in myself and my recovery process that I'm able to look at the bad within myself and the similarities between myself and my abusers with curiosity, without feeling threatened about who I am and my worth. And I hope that you guys are reaching that place for yourselves as well. And so isn't it interesting, in a very curious in a curious filled way, that this for us, this cycle of needing to see someone as all good and putting them into a fantasy role so that we can forgive them versus devaluing them and almost having to see them as all evil because we don't know how to have boundaries unless we put them in the all evil role. How this is so similar to the idealization and devaluation cycle. We have our own way that we put people in these boxes. We have our own way that we put people on pedestals, and we have our own reasons why we have to do that in order to survive whatever it is that we're trying to survive. And I'm not making excuses. All of this leads down a horrible road that's just on fire, just a giant dumpster fire. It makes relationships unsustainable long term for both people, whether cluster B or the people who are doing what I'm describing in this video. It's not sustainable for either party. But to figure out why you have to idealize people and put them in a fantasy role for yourself, because it's not the same reason as cluster B people might have to, and knowing the why has always helped me get out of my own mental cycles, my own dysfunctional mental cycles. Why do we have to idealize people and put them on a pedestal? And then why do we completely devalue them when we see negative things that are very upsetting to us? Why can't we hold both things in our hand at the same time? And do you feel like that's something that you can relearn how to do? And do you want to? Do you want to learn how to relearn how to hold both things in your hand at the same time so that you can see people more as people again and forgive them for authentic reasons, not have false forgiveness, but have like true forgiveness, learning how to have true forgiveness for people and true empathy, more balanced empathy and forgiveness that are rooted in more balanced thinking. Because the thing is, if we want to get out of limerence and if we want to get out of like fantasy-based bonding, essentially, we also have to have the ability to not think about people in fantasy roles. We also have to have the ability to let people be people. We also have to have the ability to let ourselves exist in the gray with the uncomfortable. And the uncomfortable part of all of this is sitting in the dysfunction that we've witnessed and deciding what we're actually going to do with it, not just hiding from it. We have to learn how to face the hard parts of relationships where people aren't just like super easy to be friends with, and they're not just like the super flowery, balanced person. Sometimes relationships are hard and they are a little messy. And it's not black and white where it's either evil with abuse or super easy friendships with very little effort required in the messiness. So we have to learn how to sit in the bad, and we have to learn how to handle the good of people who are difficult. What do you want your day afters to look like? What do you want your reconciliation processes to look like? Just like I've talked on this channel about how like we get to decide for ourselves what love looks like. It's not always just other people deciding for us and us just like following other people around and following their definitions. We get to choose. We also get to choose what our love list and our qualities of love, what we want that to look like for ourselves. And this is a part of love. Reconciliation, fights are inevitable. They always happen. Messiness happens. We accidentally hurt each other. These things are very real human problems. They are inevitable. And what do you want your reconciliation process to look like? What do you want it to involve? What qualities do you want to be present? This is a part of love, and this is a part of us relearning what we want love to look like. I think the next day and the reconciliation process are essentially like the key part to any relationship. Yes, you have fights, but it's actually more about how you reconcile those fights and the ways that people are allowed to exist with each other afterwards as real people after the fights. How do you process the fights? How do you think about each other after the fights? How is each person almost like required to behave after a fight? How is the fight required to be viewed perpetually onward? These are the sorts of things that I've learned are really important and make the foundation of a relationship drastically different depending on like the rules that people have for each other in the reconciliation process. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to share them down below. I always read them. I don't know if anyone else sees how maybe this was also a pattern in their life, but this was a very real problem for me for a very long time. And I genuinely was not aware of how the sort of day after a fight is such a very vulnerable and important, it's like the most important piece of the fight. And it's honestly the most important day after the fight. Is that first moment of coming back together and discussing it and processing it, and whether pushing ourselves into a fantasy and pushing each other back into a fantasy, or letting things continue to exist as remembered and real and nuanced. So anyway, thank you as always for watching, and God bless.